He left in the dead of night. No goodbye, no warning, just a whispered confession. I can't do this anymore. Prince Harry has reportedly fled Montecito in silence, boarding a secret overnight flight to the UK alone. No staff, no Meghan, no children. Just one backpack and a message that stunned even his closest aide. Sources now confirm that Harry met privately with King Charles and Prince William, reigniting speculation that the Sussex marriage is on the brink. What pushed him over the edge? Is this the beginning of the end for the exiled royals? And what was Meghan's reaction when she woke up to find him gone? What we've uncovered will leave you speechless. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It started with silence. No argument, no shouting, no slamming doors or ultimatums. Just one suitcase, one car, one royal who quietly disappeared before dawn. By the time Meghan Markle stirred from her bed in the opulent Montecito mansion, her husband Prince Harry was already halfway across the Atlantic. No farewell, no warning, just a cold absence and a note left behind with 3 chilling words. Don't wait up. The Duke of Sussex, once paraded by American media as a liberated prince who broke free from the suffocating traditions of royal life, had reached his breaking point. It wasn't an explosive fight or a media scandal that pushed him over the edge. It was something far worse. Slow, unrelenting emotional erosion. Sources close to the palace now confirm that Prince Harry's departure was not just a moment of frustration, but a calculated retreat. A private decision whispered to a single aide. No press releases. No paparazzi. No stage smiles. Just an exhausted man who had finally admitted the one thing he never dared say aloud, not to his family, not to the public, and not to his wife. I can't do this anymore. That sentence, shared in confidence to a royal aide at Heathrow Airport before boarding a red-eye flight to London, has since echoed through the corridors of both Buckingham Palace and Montecito. It speaks volumes about the turmoil brewing behind the carefully curated Sussex image, the interviews, the memoirs, the documentaries. It reveals a man caught between 2 identities, the royal he was born to be, and the version of himself he's been manipulated into becoming. This is not just another chapter in the long-running saga of Harry and Meghan. This is a seismic shift. Behind Meghan Markle's glamorous appearances and her carefully worded press statements lies a world many now believe has been deteriorating for months, if not years. With failed business ventures, crumbling brand partnerships, and increasing isolation from both Hollywood elites and the British monarchy, the Duchess's image of poise and purpose has given way to accusations of narcissism, erratic behavior, and an increasingly delusional grip on power. This video will uncover the full extent of that collapse. We'll take you deep into the final hours before Harry left, with insider accounts from royal staffers and airport witnesses who saw it happen in real time. We'll explore Meghan's reaction, described by one aide as a meltdown of nuclear proportion. We'll show how that one moment set off a domino effect that could permanently sever what little thread of connection remained between the Sussexes and the royal family. And most shockingly of all, we'll bring you details of what happened after Harry arrived in the UK, the secret meetings he held with Prince William and King Charles. Conversations that, we're told, ended with one of the most dramatic proposals yet, Harry returning to the royal fold under one condition: Meghan stays behind. Let that sink in. This isn't a tabloid distraction. This isn't gossip. This is a full-scale unraveling of a carefully constructed narrative. For years, Meghan positioned herself as the victim of an outdated monarchy. But as the dust settles, it seems that the story she told the world of independence, power, and purpose was little more than an illusion. And Harry? He's now walking through the ruins of that illusion, unsure if he'll ever find solid ground again. So why now? Why did Harry finally reach his breaking point? To understand the full weight of his silent departure, we have to rewind to the months leading up to that fateful day. Reports of tension in the Sussex household had been circulating behind closed doors for some time. Meghan's failed partnerships with major corporations, including her podcast deal with Spotify and her ambiguous lifestyle brand ventures, left her frustrated and desperate to salvage her public image. But instead of regrouping, she doubled down, pushing for more exposure, more press control, more control over Harry himself. Behind the scenes, insiders say the once-loving bond between them was fraying. Meghan, known for her assertive and often combative stance toward media portrayal, began micromanaging everything from public statements to how Harry dressed. One palace insider even claimed that Meghan had begun monitoring Harry's private messages and limiting his contact with former friends and royal family members, especially his brother, Prince William. While Meghan was busy trying to maintain a crumbling empire of image and influence, Harry was retreating further into himself. Friends report he became withdrawn, disinterested in meetings, and less enthusiastic about public appearances. He began spending long hours isolated in their estate's game room, gaming late into the night, sometimes drinking alone, and regularly ignoring Meghan's calls or texts. One particularly troubling report even describes Harry ordering excessive amounts of alcohol through room service and falling asleep in the garden more than once. Some say it was a midlife crisis. Others suggest it was something darker, a quiet mental breakdown brought on by years of identity loss, family separation, and the crushing weight of public scrutiny. But the truth, as always, is somewhere in between. The man once cheered as a rebellious royal had become a shadow of himself, worn down not just by the outside world, but by the very woman who claimed to be his greatest supporter. And when he finally reached the point where silence felt safer than words, he did what few expected. He left. He didn't consult a lawyer. He didn't write a speech. He didn't alert his PR team. He simply told a trusted aide to book him the earliest available flight to London and left without saying goodbye. His landing at Heathrow was quiet, but not unnoticed. Paparazzi spotted a lone man in a gray hoodie and cap stepping into a waiting Range Rover. It wasn't long before royal aides confirmed his presence and cleared him for private entry into the grounds of Windsor. What followed were 3 highly confidential meetings, one with King Charles, one with Prince William, and a final, unrecorded session that sources claim could mark the most consequential family negotiation since the Queen's passing. And while Harry was reconnecting with his roots, Meghan was spiraling. Several aides reported a flurry of activity at the Montecito home. Rapid calls to Meghan's legal team, emotional outbursts directed at staff, and a string of calls to press contacts that went unanswered. At one point, she allegedly screamed, "He's making the biggest mistake of his life," to no one in particular. But was he? Because if early reports are to be believed, Harry's return to the UK wasn't just about escape. It was about restoration. It was about making amends. It was about asking, finally, to come home, not just physically, but spiritually, politically, and emotionally. And the terms of that homecoming? That's something we'll explore in depth. Because King Charles reportedly made one thing clear: Harry can return, but only as Harry, not as part of a media power couple, not as a figurehead for Sussex Incorporated, and definitely not with Meghan. So what now? Where does this leave the Duchess of Sussex, whose ambition once soared so high it touched Hollywood and the palace in one breath? And where does this leave Prince Harry, the once beloved spare who may now find himself welcomed back, on conditions that could shatter the life he built across the ocean? The answers are coming. And as the silence grows louder, the world is left watching one of the most shocking royal reversals in modern history play out, not in public speeches or Netflix specials, but in quiet disappearances, whispered confessions, and private reconciliations. This is the story of a narcissistic collapse. This is the story of a royal man reclaiming his voice. And this is only the beginning. It began, like most implosions, not with fire but with ice. A slow, accumulating freeze that settled over the Sussex household in Montecito room by room, hour by hour, until the silence became deafening. That particular evening felt no different at first. Meghan had spent most of her afternoon in back-to-back calls with her legal and branding teams, discussing the next phase of her long-hyped lifestyle venture. Harry, by contrast, was nowhere to be found. Not emotionally, not mentally, not even physically in the shared rooms anymore. He had retreated to the guesthouse days prior. At first, he claimed it was because of the noise, Meghan's Zoom calls, the media chatter, the occasional paparazzi drone buzzing overhead. But those close to the couple say it was far more than that. It was the psychological noise that drove him to that secluded corner of their property, the endless strategizing, image management, and a constant undercurrent of accusation, however carefully veiled. Harry had stopped responding, not in the way of a man avoiding confrontation, but in the way of someone who had run out of emotional bandwidth. When Meghan spoke, he listened, but only with the outer shell of himself. He nodded at the right moments, made appropriate comments when pressed, but his eyes were elsewhere, usually staring beyond the windows, locked on the distant sea. By midnight, he wasn't in the house. Meghan didn't ask why. Perhaps she had grown used to it. Perhaps she thought he would eventually come back. But this time, something was different. Sources say Harry had packed his bag earlier that day, not in the rush of a man fleeing, but in the quiet resolution of someone making peace with an unavoidable truth. He placed his essentials inside, a change of clothes, documents, a watch that once belonged to his mother, and an envelope addressed simply with the letter M. There were no suitcases, just one rugged backpack, military style, like the kind he used to carry during his days in Afghanistan. This wasn't a media stunt. There were no photographers, no calls to press, no statements prepared, no grand exit speech. This was a retreat in its purest form, strategic, sorrowful, and necessary. At 2:46 a.m., a black unmarked vehicle rolled quietly into the driveway of the Montecito estate. A single staff member opened the gate manually to avoid noise. The engine stayed running. No words were exchanged. Harry emerged from the guest house, hoodie up, head down, and walked briskly to the car. No Meghan in sight. No one calling after him. He didn't look back. Surveillance footage later leaked to a freelance journalist shows the car exiting the estate under cover of darkness and turning onto the main road heading toward LAX. The timestamp was unmistakable. So was the man's silhouette inside the vehicle. Harry had made his move. At the airport, staff who recognized him kept their distance. He carried no entourage, no visible security, just a hat pulled low and a British passport clutched tightly in his hand. He booked his ticket under a low-profile alias that sources say was already flagged to UK customs in advance. Inside a dimly lit private terminal, a royal aide was waiting, someone who had once served both William and Harry years ago before tensions tore the brothers apart. It was this aide who would later report the words Harry uttered while standing at the foot of the boarding stairs, passport still in hand, staring up at the aircraft that would carry him away from the life he'd built in California. "I can't do this anymore." Not screamed, not sobbed, just stated. Flat, final, as if it had been on his lips for months and only now found its way out. The aide nodded, offered no judgment, and handed Harry a file, likely documents prepared by Buckingham Palace detailing what would happen next. The flight left just before 4 a.m. bound for London Heathrow. By the time the sun rose over California, Prince Harry was flying east at 35,000 feet, leaving behind a life that had grown more toxic than free. What led to this decisive break? Insiders paint a picture of months of internal unraveling. Harry, they say, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of their public brand. He had willingly participated in the infamous Oprah interview, the Netflix docuseries, and the explosive memoir Spare. But with each new exposure came fallout, not only from the press or the public, but from within, his own family, his inner circle, and finally, from himself. Friends reported that Harry felt empty after the initial wave of sympathy and support faded and was replaced with cynicism and backlash. He had spoken his truth, but it hadn't brought healing. Only headlines. The rawness of his mother's death, the pain of leaving the only life he had ever known, and the strain of trying to reinvent himself as an American icon under Meghan's strategic vision had all begun to weigh him down. He missed his brother. He missed his father. He missed the structure, the history, and even the obligation that came with being a royal. And no amount of podcast interviews or Netflix deals could fill the hollow space that had taken root inside him. Meanwhile, Meghan had thrown herself deeper into brand building. Fashion, food, wellness, all the aesthetics of a lifestyle mogul, but none of the staying power. Business ventures fizzled. Partnerships were pulled. Investors became skittish. Behind the scenes, she doubled down on control. Sources say she became increasingly paranoid about leaks and sabotage, often blaming Harry's British friends or staff still loyal to the crown. One assistant reportedly left in tears after Meghan accused her of sending private emails to a royal correspondent. Another was let go after allegedly forgetting to sign a non-disclosure agreement fast enough. Staff turnover reached a level that concerned even the Duchess's PR firm, which warned her privately that instability inside the home would eventually leak out. It did. In public, she smiled. In private, she seethed. And Harry, caught in the middle, stopped talking. It wasn't defiance. It was surrender. A quiet, growing sense of emotional paralysis that eventually turned into escape. Sources claim Harry's final straw came weeks before his departure, during an alleged screaming match over the release of a new documentary trailer. Meghan had reportedly demanded full creative control, including edits to Harry's own voiceover to make him sound more authoritative. Harry refused. A rare act of defiance that reportedly led to a 48-hour standoff in which the couple barely spoke, and Harry disappeared to a hotel for 2 nights. When he returned, he said nothing. But the wheels were already in motion. The decision to leave wasn't impulsive. It had been building in his heart for months. The man once praised for choosing love over duty was now realizing he may have lost both. By the time Harry touched down at Heathrow, news of his arrival had not yet leaked. But within hours, whispers spread through the royal press corps. Something was happening. Something unprecedented. Harry had returned. But not with fanfare or purpose. He had come home alone. And that, perhaps, was the most revealing detail of all. Not even Meghan knew he was gone until the next morning. Long before Prince Harry stepped foot on that flight to London, the fissures within his marriage were already deepening. To the public, the Sussexes maintained a curated image of resilience, love, and shared purpose, a royal couple reinventing themselves as modern trailblazers in America. But behind the scenes, far from red carpets and professional photo ops, a different story had been quietly unfolding. The truth is, their world began to crack long before Harry's silent exit. It didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual, grinding disintegration, an erosion of trust, vision, and emotional cohesion. Not the dramatic collapse of a storm, but the creeping pressure of foundational instability that eventually made the entire structure wobble. The first sign, many believe, came shortly after the publication of Harry's memoir, Spare. Initially anticipated as a brave act of transparency, the book was meant to catapult Harry into the public sphere as a self-made man, willing to confront his pain, trauma, and the failings of his upbringing. But its impact was different than expected. Instead of cementing his narrative, it painted Harry as a deeply wounded, often contradictory figure, part victim, part aggressor, and, to some, a pawn. Meghan had supported the memoir. She'd encouraged it, helped review parts of it, and had been deeply invested in how it was received. But once the backlash began, once critics and comedians alike began to satirize Harry's confessions, her tone changed. Privately, insiders say, she questioned whether Harry had shared too much. Not because it hurt the family, but because it hurt her image. She was quick to distance herself from some of the more controversial passages. One aide revealed Meghan was furious that the book included details about her text arguments with Catherine, Princess of Wales, especially during the build-up to the royal wedding. The aide described Meghan's reaction as cold and surgical. She allegedly told Harry, "You made me look like the villain." From that point on, according to sources close to the couple, Meghan became increasingly guarded about their joint narrative. Every interview request, every media appearance, every project proposal was filtered through a tight circle of PR strategists and brand consultants. And Harry, once the freer spirit of the two, began to fade into the background. He stopped participating as actively in their public endeavors. His once enthusiastic demeanor during interviews turned passive. Observers noted that Meghan often took the lead, interrupting Harry to redirect answers, reshaping the message mid-interview. It became clear to many that Harry was no longer speaking from the heart, but from a prepared script. Behind closed doors, things were more strained than ever. Friends of the couple noted that Harry had grown more distant from his longtime support system. Old army buddies, childhood friends, even palace aides he once trusted, nearly all of them had been quietly cut out. Some say Meghan encouraged it. Others say Harry did it willingly to keep the peace. Either way, it left him isolated. And isolation can breed doubt. While Meghan poured her energy into the launch of new business initiatives, Harry found himself disengaged. He was said to be skeptical of her ever-shifting business plans, an organic skincare line one month, a Montecito cooking show the next, followed by vague teasers of a digital empire that never fully materialized. Each project came with grand promises and media buzz, but few of them delivered the staying power needed to sustain their growing expenses. When Spotify abruptly ended their multi-million-dollar podcast deal, the palace reportedly took notice, but it was Harry's private reaction. A former Spotify executive anonymously reported that Harry seemed embarrassed and defeated in the final Zoom meetings before the deal was pulled. He was polite but unenthusiastic. Meghan, in contrast, allegedly tried to dominate the conversation, demanding more visibility and strategic autonomy. When it became clear that Spotify was moving on, Meghan reportedly blamed the platform's lack of vision, not their content. Harry, sources say, didn't fight back. He simply went quiet. This pattern continued with subsequent deals. Meghan's attempts to partner with major brands were met with hesitation, often citing PR risk. Her insistence on complete narrative control made even progressive companies wary. And with every new rejection came more internal tension. One former assistant disclosed that the couple's private disagreements were becoming more frequent and more toxic. Meghan, she claimed, would rehearse arguments in advance, laying out every possible objection Harry might raise and crafting retorts ahead of time. It was less of a marriage discussion and more of a press interview rehearsal, staged and strategic. Harry, by contrast, didn't push back as often. But when he did, it was impactful. One major argument, described by a Montecito staff member, revolved around Meghan's plan to relaunch her long-defunct lifestyle blog, The Tick. Meghan reportedly believed the blog could position her as a global lifestyle authority, rivaling figures like Gwyneth Paltrow or Martha Stewart. But Harry disagreed. He believed it would backfire, casting her as a brand-chasing influencer rather than the humanitarian she once claimed to be. The disagreement escalated when Harry allegedly refused to participate in a promotional video Meghan wanted to shoot for the blog's relaunch. He told her flatly, "I don't want to play pretend anymore." That line, according to those close to the couple, echoed through the house for days. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came not through arguments, but in the quiet moments, the ones filled with absence rather than noise. Harry had begun sleeping in separate quarters weeks before his flight to the UK. He would rise early, leave the house for long drives along the Pacific Coast Highway, and return hours later without explanation. When asked about his whereabouts, he would shrug and reply, "I just needed to think." The Montecito estate, once a symbol of freedom and renewal, had become a gilded cage. The sprawling home, filled with perfectly curated interiors and luxury touches, now echoed with tension. Staffers report that Meghan kept close tabs on their movements, issuing new rules about privacy, visitor access, and personal interactions. Several longtime employees resigned in quick succession. Outside the home, rumors were circulating. Hollywood insiders whispered that Meghan was becoming unmanageable. She had reportedly alienated several of her own allies through aggressive negotiation tactics and unrealistic brand expectations. When approached about new projects, some studio executives reportedly rolled their eyes and said, "We'll pass on the royal drama." Harry, caught between his wife's ambitions and his own disillusionment, turned inward. He began spending more time alone, reading, gaming, and reconnecting secretly with people from his past. Friends say he began emailing one of his former army commanders, seeking advice about starting over. He also reached out to a therapist he'd met years earlier during a royal initiative on mental health. These quiet, deliberate steps were not about rebellion, they were about survival. The final fracture, as revealed in multiple anonymous accounts, came after a simple dinner party gone wrong. The Sussexes had invited a high-profile entertainment couple over for a private dinner at their home. Meghan was allegedly eager to discuss a potential collaboration, but Harry was disengaged the entire night, barely speaking, sipping wine, and excusing himself early to retreat to the guest house. The guests left quietly. Meghan reportedly exploded afterward. She accused Harry of sabotage, of embarrassing her, of intentionally undercutting her efforts. Harry responded with a whisper that barely carried past the hallway walls. "I don't want this life anymore." It was the first time he had said it out loud. Meghan was stunned. She told him to grow up, that you knew what you were signing up for. But the words had already landed, and they couldn't be unsaid. That was the final confirmation Harry needed. He made his decision that night. No more strategy. No more performance. No more compromise. He would return to the only place that might still accept him. Not as a brand, but as a brother, a son, a man. And he would do it quietly, without permission or apology. The truth has a way of slipping through even the most carefully drawn borders. No matter how meticulously managed the narrative, or how tightly controlled the inner circle, reality always finds its voice, often in the places we least expect. For Meghan Markle, the unraveling began not with a scandal exposed on television or a microphone left hot, but in the private spaces she assumed were impenetrable, her personal notes, her routines, and, as insiders now claim, a diary she once referred to as her truth vault. According to multiple former aides and 2 dismissed House staff members, Meghan kept a detailed private journal. Though she reportedly referred to it as a form of self-care, entries often contained raw, unfiltered thoughts about those around her, including friends, business partners, members of the royal family, and, at times, even Harry himself. The diary was said to be locked inside a personal safe in her home office and was never shared with Harry. But when trust eroded and silence took hold between them, Harry, intentionally or not, discovered its presence. One insider alleges that during a routine security review following the departure of two Montecito House staff members, Harry came across notes from Meghan's diary stored on a password-protected tablet connected to their shared cloud server. It wasn't a snooping incident, they insist. Rather, it was a stark accident, one that opened a door he never meant to enter. What he read inside, as described by a source close to the situation, left him speechless. The entries weren't just personal reflections. They were strategic thoughts, observations, tactical plans. In several pages reportedly dated shortly after the Oprah interview, Meghan appeared to question the usefulness of Harry's emotional disclosures, suggesting, in writing, that he overshared and may have weakened their long-term brand by appearing too broken. One passage allegedly read, "Harry is brave, but not strategic. His pain serves a purpose, but it must be edited before being presented to the world." Another, even more telling, referred to Princess Catherine. "Kate plays the long game. She is obedient to the image. But the image itself is false, and that gives us power, if we're willing to seize it." Whether these notes were simply reflections or something more calculating is a matter of interpretation. But for Harry, already emotionally fraying and feeling dislocated from his own sense of agency, they were confirmation of a gnawing suspicion that Meghan viewed their relationship, at least in part, as a means to an end. And the timing couldn't have been worse. In the public sphere, Meghan's star was already dimming. Her post-royal identity was initially fueled by empathy and fascination. She had positioned herself as a symbol of modern womanhood, confident, wronged, and unapologetic. But with every new headline, the sheen began to wear off. The Archetypes podcast, once anticipated as a powerful platform for women's voices, lost momentum quickly. Its episodes, described by critics as overproduced and oddly performative, failed to capture the widespread cultural traction her team hoped for. Though her voice carried gravitas, the conversations felt tightly choreographed, rarely allowing guests to speak freely or dive into challenging territory. One former Spotify producer reportedly called the sessions a stage dance rather than a dialogue. Behind the scenes, production was a mess. Delays were frequent. Meghan allegedly insisted on multiple re-recordings of her own lines to maintain tone consistency, often days or weeks after the original interviews were conducted. Staff began to raise concerns about project sustainability. Budget overruns triggered internal reviews. And ultimately, Spotify declined to renew the deal, stating publicly that the arrangement did not meet mutual expectations. Meghan was livid. Insiders claim she believed Spotify's statement was a personal betrayal. She accused them of leaking internal performance figures and began re-evaluating all current and future partnerships. WME, her talent agency, reportedly attempted to cool her down, warning that retaliatory legal threats would only further damage her image. But Meghan, already consumed by the narrative of personal persecution, allegedly demanded that her team go on the offense. Shortly after, Meghan's proposed digital relaunch of the TIG was halted without public explanation. The blog, once a lifestyle darling filled with curated recipes and reflections, had been earmarked for a high-end comeback. But according to two individuals involved in the early branding stages, creative differences stalled the process almost immediately. Meghan had a vision, but it lacked a stable framework. Investors were hesitant. Collaborators pulled out. The blog, like the podcast, evaporated into silence. And with each project that collapsed, the narrative Meghan had worked so hard to build began to decay, publicly and privately. Her inner circle tightened. Phone calls were screened. Former friends who spoke to the press were labeled traitors. But even those still loyal began to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the business failures. It was the mood in Montecito. Meghan had grown unpredictable, even volatile. Staff reported she would vacillate between high-energy optimism and sudden withdrawal. One assistant described walking into a room and finding Meghan crying while scrolling through Twitter, only to be smiling and pitching a podcast idea moments later. Another described an afternoon meeting with Meghan and a team of creative consultants. She was furious that one of them questioned her royal knowledge. She said, "I lived it. You researched it. Don't ever confuse the two." Then she left the room for an hour, came back, and offered everyone vegan cupcakes like nothing had happened. Harry, at first, tried to support her. He remained present during most meetings, nodding at the right times, offering brief commentary, but never leading. His role had become increasingly passive, more of a consort than a partner. Friends say he rarely contributed to decisions, and when asked privately about new business ventures, his answers were vague and uncertain. But after the diary discovery, after reading her thoughts about their marriage, their brand, and even his usefulness, something shifted in him. He stopped defending her in private conversations. When friends raised concerns, he didn't argue. He just listened. And that silence spoke volumes. Meghan's public appearances, once glamorous and commanding, began to feel strained. Her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes. Her speeches, often filled with broad empowerment language, lacked the authenticity that once made her relatable. Even her fashion choices, once dissected and celebrated by tabloids, drew less attention. The media had moved on, and the spotlight was growing colder. The final embarrassment came during an international women's summit where Meghan had been expected to deliver the keynote address. According to reports, the event's organizers quietly downgraded her to a panel position, citing logistical issues. Meghan pulled out days before the event, with her team claiming schedule conflicts, but insiders suggest the truth was far more personal. The event's sponsors were reportedly uneasy about her polarizing perception, particularly following the fallout from her podcast and growing rumors of internal instability in her household. This kind of public rejection hit Meghan hard. In response, she reportedly doubled down on controlling the narrative, holding emergency meetings with PR advisors and lawyers to refocus her image. There was talk of a new documentary, an exclusive sit-down with a sympathetic journalist, and even a potential memoir, this time from her perspective alone. But nothing came to fruition. All talk, no follow-through. And Harry, once again, withdrew. One morning, weeks before he left for the UK, he was spotted alone at a beachside cafe in Santa Barbara. Witnesses say he looked tired, pale, eyes sunken, unshaven. He ordered a coffee and sat for an hour staring out at the waves. No phone, no laptop, just quiet. It was one of the last public sightings before his sudden departure. And when he finally did leave, when he finally decided he could no longer sustain the performance, the private diary and the public failures converged into a singular truth. This life, this plan, this carefully engineered identity, they were never really his. They belonged to someone else. And he was done pretending. For any royal child, birth is more than just a miracle of life. It's an entry into a centuries-old system of power, duty, and legacy. From the moment they take their first breath, their names are recorded in the great ledgers of royal history. With that name comes title, responsibility, protection, and wealth. But what happens when doubt creeps into the very heart of that system? What happens when legacy, once assumed to be a birthright, is suddenly questioned at its root? This was the storm quietly brewing around Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana. And while no formal statement was ever released to the public, behind palace walls, discussions had reached a fever pitch. The issue wasn't just legal or constitutional. It was deeply personal. And it had divided the royal family into factions, those who believed silence was loyalty, and those who believed silence was complicity. At the center of this conflict was an unspoken but persistent rumor that King Charles, increasingly influenced by senior advisors and even pressured by William, had considered removing Archie and Lilibet from the royal line of inheritance. Not out of cruelty or vengeance, but because of one lingering question that refused to go away. Were they truly royal? The whispers began the moment Meghan and Harry announced they would not reveal the identities of the children's godparents. That decision, while within their right, raised eyebrows across the royal institution. Tradition dictated transparency in matters of lineage, not secrecy. But the Sussexes had a new approach, one rooted in privacy and brand management. When Lilibet was born in California and named after the Queen's personal childhood nickname without the palace's prior consent, tensions deepened. Insiders say the Queen, though gracious in public, was privately wounded. The gesture, meant as a tribute, came across to some as a calculated move, a branding tactic rather than a family honor. But the true fracture came months later when internal royal documents, some say minutes from confidential family discussions, revealed Charles's increasing concern over what he reportedly called the integrity of the line. Sources claim the monarch, though reserved on the surface, had been quietly advised by a team of legal and constitutional experts to clarify succession rights in the wake of Harry's separation from royal duties. It was during these meetings, held under strict confidentiality, that the question of paternity was raised, not as an accusation, but as a safeguard. If Meghan and Harry were no longer serving royals, if their children were born and raised abroad, outside of royal oversight, and if so much surrounding their births remained concealed from palace procedures, how could the line of inheritance remain unchallenged? William, according to multiple reports, did not hold back. He is said to have written a letter to his father, later leaked, outlining the need for a definitive resolution. The wording was firm but not cruel. He reportedly wrote, "In absence of transparency, the Crown cannot afford ambiguity. If there is doubt, we must resolve it. If there is truth, we must confirm it." Those close to Charles say he agonized over the matter. He loved his grandchildren, but he also bore the weight of a 1,000-year institution. The monarchy, he believed, must be above reproach. A scandal involving succession rights could do irreparable damage, especially at a time when public support for the royal family was already volatile. Yet Charles hesitated. He knew what a request for DNA confirmation would do. It would shatter any remaining hope of reconciliation with Harry. It would open the door to public outrage, media frenzy, and possible legal retaliation. Most of all, it would devastate the family on a human level. And so, the idea was shelved, at least temporarily. But that didn't stop other measures from being taken. Charles reportedly instructed royal lawyers to review the royal will. Specifically, clauses related to inheritance and the trust funds established under the Queen's former oversight. Traditionally, royal grandchildren receive financial protection through carefully structured trusts, land titles, and access to specific royal holdings. These are not privileges freely granted. They're embedded within a larger legacy that assumes allegiance, participation, and transparency. Yet in the case of Archie and Lilibet, the rules were being rewritten. Quietly, discreetly. A well-placed royal insider revealed that several revisions were made to the documentation governing future disbursements. The updated language reportedly states that direct royal heirs maintaining active service within the crown shall be prioritized in matters of inheritance and estate succession. While vague, the change was seen by many as a legal mechanism to limit access for Harry's children without outright removing them. In effect, they would remain in name, but not in entitlement. When news of this reached Meghan, the reaction was explosive. One of her personal aides claimed Meghan stormed into a private Zoom call with her legal counsel and branding team the day after she was informed. Her voice, reportedly shaking with rage, declared, "They're trying to erase my children." She then allegedly contacted Harry, who was in the middle of a separate meeting, demanding he respond to the family directly. But Harry, torn between loyalty to his children and fatigue from years of conflict, reportedly responded with 6 quiet words. "We should have seen this coming." That response, according to those close to Meghan, marked a turning point. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that Harry's heart was drifting, that his willingness to fight back was no longer guaranteed, that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand the limits of their independence. After all, they had chosen to step back. They had demanded freedom, but with freedom came the loss of royal shelter. For Meghan, this was unacceptable. She began privately pushing for Harry to return to the UK to confront his family. Not to reconcile, but to warn. To remind them that she too had power. Stories, emails, recordings. According to one insider, Meghan hinted that she would go nuclear if the children were formally excluded. But Harry resisted. He had grown weary of war, of threats, of strategy. Instead of planning a legal retaliation, he began planning something else, a return trip to London. Not to confront, but to speak, to understand, to see, with his own eyes, what was left of the family he had once abandoned for love. When he finally boarded that plane and whispered those words to his aide, "I can't do this anymore," many believe this question of inheritance was a driving force. Not just because of what it meant for Archie and Lilibet, but because of what it said about Harry himself. He had spent years telling the world that family was everything, that he left the palace to protect his wife and children. But if even their royal legacy was being dismantled, what had he truly saved them from? And what had they gained in return? A Montecito mansion? A media circus? A life that no longer made sense? The inheritance question wasn't just about money. It wasn't even just about titles. It was about identity, about legacy, about whether or not his children would be remembered as part of the royal story or quietly written out of it. And in the end, it forced Harry to confront a brutal truth. Without proof, there is no legacy. In the high-stakes arena of royal crises, silence can often speak louder than denial. In the days and then weeks following Gabriella Morris's public revelation, the world waited for Meghan Markle to respond. A statement, a denial, an explanation, something, anything. But what came was nothing. No press release, no Instagram post, no appearance at charity events, not even an anonymous source speaking on her behalf. Meghan, once the master of narrative control, vanished from public view. For a woman who had spent the past 5 years cultivating an image rooted in accessibility, openness, and emotional transparency, the abrupt silence felt unnatural. This was someone who had penned heartfelt essays about her miscarriages, discussed her family life with Oprah, and built her public brand on the strength of her voice. But now, as the most defining scandal of her public life exploded across every media outlet in the world, she said nothing. This absence did not go unnoticed. The press began to speculate immediately. "Where is Meghan?" headlines asked. "Why won't she defend herself?" Some speculated she had fled California and was hiding abroad, possibly in Canada or Switzerland. Others suggested she had retreated into legal strategy mode, waiting for the right moment to mount a defense after consulting her attorneys and crisis managers. But behind palace walls, Meghan's silence was triggering something more immediate: panic. The British royal family, often referred to as the firm for its cold efficiency, had been blindsided by Gabriella's revelation. This wasn't a tabloid scandal about affairs or fashion choices. This was a direct attack on the credibility of the monarchy's bloodline and succession claims. And whether they supported or resented Harry and Meghan privately, the consequences of this revelation had the potential to spiral out of the institution's control. Senior aides convened in emergency sessions. Legal advisors reviewed all documentation relating to Archie's birth, titles, and financial entitlements. The question looming over every conversation was the same: if Archie is not Meghan's biological child, and if Meghan knowingly presented him as such, how does that affect the monarchy? It wasn't just about deception. It was about precedence. Never before in modern British royal history had a member of the royal family been accused of falsely claiming maternity over a child of potential royal blood. It called into question every document signed, every public grant issued, every press statement made on behalf of Archie. Could public funds have been improperly allocated? Could state resources, such as security, transportation, or diplomatic protections, have been misused based on a false premise? Behind closed doors, King Charles was reportedly livid. Though estranged from his youngest son, Charles still maintained a sense of duty to the crown above all else. According to an unnamed palace aide, Charles saw the scandal as an existential threat. "This isn't just embarrassing," the source explained. "It's dangerous. It undermines the credibility of the institution. It puts the entire line of succession under a microscope." There was talk of launching a private investigation into the matter. Some within the palace pushed for DNA testing of all royal heirs as a way of affirming the crown's legitimacy once and for all. Others warned against opening that door, fearing the flood of scrutiny it could invite. Meanwhile, Meghan's silence grew heavier. The public expected her to deny the claims, to file a lawsuit, or at the very least to refute Gabriella's story with evidence of her own. Instead, she reportedly went into complete isolation. Journalists staked out the Montecito estate, but saw no signs of movement. Meghan's mother, Doria Ragland, was seen entering the property once and leaving hours later, her expression grim and unspeaking. Paparazzi managed to capture a grainy image of Meghan peeking through a window, but there was no confirmation of her emotional or mental state. And still, she said nothing. Psychologists and crisis communications experts began to weigh in. Some argued her silence was strategic. "She's buying time," one crisis PR expert said. "She's gathering legal ammunition before making a counterstrike. When the stakes are this high, you don't speak until your lawyers tell you to breathe." Others saw it differently. "This isn't a legal pause," said a former royal staffer turned author. "This is a meltdown." Meghan has never faced a scandal she couldn't spin. This is different. This is not opinion. This is DNA. You can't spin science. Behind the scenes, Meghan's team reportedly began dissolving. 2 high-ranking public relations specialists allegedly severed ties with her firm within 1 week of the story breaking. Several key staff members associated with her and Harry's Archewell Foundation were quietly reassigned or laid off. Emails leaked from internal company channels hinted at chaos. "There's no plan," one message read. "She's gone dark. No one knows what to do." In parallel, her former Hollywood connections began to distance themselves. Endorsement contracts stalled. A long-rumored second book deal was put on hold. Netflix, already struggling with declining viewership for the Sussex documentary series, reportedly froze payments tied to further projects until Meghan's legal standing could be clarified. The silence, once a tactic, was becoming a trap. And yet, even as the public waited for a word from Meghan, the palace's anxiety intensified. Because her silence wasn't just affecting her own reputation, it was sucking the oxygen out of everything around her. Royal engagements were interrupted by protesters holding signs reading "DNA doesn't lie." News broadcasts devoted entire segments to debating the legitimacy of Archie's royal standing. International leaders began sidestepping questions about royal protocols involving the Sussex children. Every hour Meghan refused to speak, the pressure increased, not just on her, but on Harry, on the king, and on the legacy of the House of Windsor itself. And then came the warning. A document quietly surfaced online, unverified at first, but later confirmed as authentic. It was a cease and desist letter from Meghan's legal team, directed toward Gabriella Morris and her attorneys. The letter warned against further public disclosure of personal medical information and threatened legal action for defamation, emotional distress, and unauthorized use of private data. But notably, the letter never denied the DNA results. It didn't reject Gabriella's claim. It didn't dispute the authenticity of the test. It didn't even assert that Meghan was Archie's biological mother. That omission was louder than any statement could have been. Legal experts dissected the letter. "This is not a denial," one UK barrister said on live television. "This is damage control disguised as legal intimidation. It's an attempt to scare the truth back into silence." But by then, it was too late. Public support for Meghan had plummeted. Celebrities who once praised her were now mute. Political leaders who once spoke her name with reverence now refused to comment. She was radioactive, untouchable, a liability. And through it all, she remained silent. Perhaps she believed silence would protect her, that if she said nothing, the world would move on. But this story, rooted not in scandal but in cold, undeniable DNA evidence, would not go away. It would continue to grow, to claw at the foundations of her image, to demand answers she either could not or would not give. For the first time since marrying into the royal family, Meghan Markle had lost control of the story. And Buckingham Palace, once her antagonist, now found itself cornered, forced to deal with the wreckage of a silence that screamed louder than any lie. If there was ever a moment when Prince Harry could have walked back into the royal fold without confrontation or condition, that moment had long passed. What awaited him upon his silent return to the United Kingdom wasn't warmth, sympathy, or a brother's embrace. It was something colder, sharper, and far more calculated. The royal inner circle, once a fortress of mutual duty and bloodline loyalty, had quietly decided something long before Harry's arrival. They had drawn a line, and Meghan Markle was no longer just unwelcome. She was untouchable. This decision wasn't made out of spite. It was strategic, self-protective, and, as several insiders argue, absolutely necessary. The royal family had spent the better part of 3 years defending itself against a series of damaging allegations. From racism claims to accusations of emotional neglect, the monarchy had been dragged into the global spotlight again and again, usually orchestrated from a Montecito estate thousands of miles away. The Oprah interview was the first blow. Then came the Netflix series, then Spare. Each installment carved deeper fissures within the family. And while the public could only speculate about the damage inside the palace walls, it was undeniable. Staff morale plummeted. Senior aides were reassigned or resigned. Communication protocols were tightened. Trust became a rare commodity. Even among the royals themselves, suspicion brewed quietly. Who said what? Who leaked what? Who could be counted on to keep the crown intact? Prince William, by all reports, hardened the fastest. Once known as Harry's best friend, confidant, and partner in mischief, he had become one of his brother's most vocal opponents privately, at least. William viewed Harry's public disclosures as an unforgivable betrayal, not because they exposed personal hurt, but because they endangered the monarchy's long-term survival. William had always been raised to inherit the throne. For him, the crown wasn't just a symbol, it was a lifelong burden to be carried with dignity. And Harry's behavior had, in William's eyes, thrown gasoline on the fire of anti-monarchy sentiment during one of the most vulnerable periods in royal history. When Harry returned, William didn't rush to see him. Sources close to Kensington Palace confirmed that William was briefed about his brother's arrival within hours. Yet he delayed any meeting for nearly 3 days. It wasn't pettiness. It was intentional. William wanted to make it clear that he wasn't playing by Harry's timeline anymore. The palace would set the terms, not the prodigal son. Princess Anne was even less forgiving. Known for her strict loyalty to duty and her disdain for emotional drama, and had reportedly told the king directly that any attempt to reintegrate Meghan into royal life, socially or symbolically, would be a mistake. In one now circulated conversation allegedly leaked by a palace aide, and reportedly said, "Let her fade. No more shadows on this house." Prince Edward, usually seen as the more diplomatic of the siblings, took a quieter stance. But even he expressed concern about what he called the precedent of performance. He warned that if Harry was allowed to rejoin the family without renouncing the public theatrics of the past years, it would damage the monarchy's internal authority and public reputation permanently. Even Camilla, who had once shown compassion to Harry, allegedly closed the door. Insiders say Camilla was especially incensed by passages in Spare that painted her as manipulative and self-interested. She believed Meghan had fueled those perceptions and had advised Charles against any overtures of reconciliation that might include both Harry and Meghan. "Bring him back if you must," she was said to have told Charles. But not her. Never her. Charles, as king and father, was the most conflicted. He wanted peace. He wanted unity. But he also understood power and what happens when it's eroded from within. After the Queen's death, the institution was fragile. The Commonwealth was re-evaluating its ties. The public was questioning the relevance of the monarchy in the modern age. Scandals had to be minimized. Public confidence had to be restored. Charles met with senior advisors, legal experts, public relations strategists, constitutional scholars, to assess the risks and optics of allowing Harry back into any visible royal function. The consensus was clear. If Harry wanted to return, it would have to be on strict, non-negotiable terms. Meghan would be excluded from all royal events, decisions, and communications. Her presence at any public ceremony would be deemed a liability. It was decided behind closed doors, then later communicated through intermediaries. One such intermediary was Sir Geoffrey Williams, a longtime palace liaison who had once managed sensitive transitions during the Diana years. He met Harry in a private room within Clarence House and reportedly handed him a sealed folder. Inside were the terms. Harry could resume a ceremonial, non-political role within the royal family, appearances only. No official titles would be restored, no security reinstated. He would be required to issue a private written pledge of non-disclosure regarding future family matters. And, crucially, he would have to accept that Meghan was not invited to any future royal gathering, state function, or charitable initiative endorsed by the monarchy. The reaction from Harry, according to Sir Geoffrey, was not anger, but grief. He reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before asking, "Is there no way forward with her?" To which the answer was delivered carefully, but finally, "Not anymore." It was the coldest moment in years of already frozen relations. And yet, for those within the royal circle, it was seen not as cruelty, but as protection. Palace insiders had not forgotten the email leaks, the celebrity alliances, or the accusations hurled through media channels that were impossible to respond to. They hadn't forgotten Meghan's refusal to disclose the names of her maternity staff, the alleged staged photos, or her often combative stance against royal protocols. They hadn't forgotten the headlines. More than anything, they hadn't forgotten that Meghan had declared them an institution of trauma and then expected an invitation to tea. The inner circle now operated with a new rule: self-preservation before sentiment. Even royal charities that once collaborated with the Sussexes had distanced themselves. The Royal Foundation, spearheaded by William and Catherine, removed all legacy Sussex-related initiatives from their marketing platforms. Royal patronages once shared between the brothers quietly reassigned duties to other family members. It was as though Meghan had never existed. Harry, of course, still held value within the royal machine. Not because of his titles, but because of his humanity. The public still remembered him as the grieving boy who walked behind his mother's casket, as the soldier who served with humility, as the prince who laughed, who cried, who bared his wounds. But even that currency had limits. He was no longer the heir's confidant, no longer the Queen's favorite, no longer the fun, rebellious heart of the firm. He was now a variable. and the royal family had grown allergic to variables. Still, not all was lost. Charles reportedly offered Harry a conditional arrangement, an opportunity to rejoin a handful of legacy projects, particularly those close to the memory of Diana. Mental health, veterans' welfare, and anti-landmine initiatives were back on the table, but only if Harry walked the new line. No memoirs, no interviews, no cameras, just quiet duty. And Meghan? She was simply not to be discussed. When news of this internal decision reached Montecito, Meghan's reaction was predictable and seismic. One aide reported that she spent an entire evening on the phone with her legal team. She called it a smear campaign. She claimed the palace was acting like a vindictive corporation. She vowed not to be erased. That same night, she allegedly contacted a high-profile American journalist, hinting at a new project, her own version of events, her own truth. But truth, as she would learn, means little to those who no longer listen. The royal inner circle had turned cold, not just to her, but to the version of Harry she had helped create. What they wanted now was not a star, not a rebel, not a brand. They wanted the brother, the son, the man who once understood the silent oath of royal blood. Serve without noise, suffer without complaint, and never bring shame to the crown. When Meghan Markle first arrived in Hollywood after stepping down from royal duties, she was greeted with polite smiles and strategic handshakes. To many in the industry, she represented something fresh, a royal with a modern edge, capable of drawing massive attention and redefining what it meant to be influential in the 21st century. For the first few months, the buzz around Meghan was deafening. Meetings were scheduled with powerful executives, production companies showed interest in collaborations, and magazine covers featured her face with glowing headlines about reinvention, purpose, and global appeal. But that high, as many in Hollywood know, is fleeting. And for Meghan, it didn't take long for the illusions of power to be replaced by a very different reality. The Hollywood dream she had envisioned, wielding influence without resistance, commanding boardrooms, shaping culture on her own terms, soon began to unravel. It didn't implode overnight. Just like in Montecito, it was a slow, steady unraveling. The smiles became tighter, the meetings became shorter, and the hands that were once outstretched began to pull away. At the heart of it was the glaring gap between perception and performance. Executives quickly realized that Meghan, despite her fame, was difficult to package. She didn't want to be an actress again. She didn't want to take roles. She wanted to create, direct, control, and headline, without necessarily proving the track record that the industry demands for such power. Her deal with Netflix, initially touted as a creative revolution, failed to deliver the kind of content that justified its cost. While Harry and Meghan drew initial curiosity, the series was criticized as overly self-congratulatory and lacking substance. Internally, Netflix executives questioned her team's ability to follow through on other pitches. Multiple sources within Netflix confirmed that Meghan proposed a range of projects. From animated feminist tales to documentary exposés on global inequality, but few moved past the development phase. Meetings became strained. Deadlines were missed. Creative differences became frequent. Some inside the company began referring to her as a brand in search of a vision. Things worsened when her animated series, Pearl, was unceremoniously scrapped during an internal shakeup. Though Meghan attempted to downplay the cancellation, insiders said she was furious behind closed doors. She allegedly blamed the streaming giant for poor promotion and short-sightedness, claiming that they lacked the courage to support content with real impact. But that wasn't how Hollywood saw it. Executives were beginning to question whether Meghan understood the business at all. Producing content isn't just about ideas, it's about execution, relationships, and trust. Meghan, by then, had alienated several collaborators. She was seen as controlling, unwilling to compromise, and often dismissive of experienced professionals who disagreed with her creative instincts. A senior producer at a major entertainment firm who had worked briefly with Meghan recalled a tense meeting in which she allegedly told the room, "You need to stop thinking like old Hollywood. That's not who I am." To which one executive reportedly responded under his breath, "That's the problem." The final blow came when Spotify terminated its multi-million-dollar partnership with Archwell Audio. The move stunned the public, but was entirely expected behind the scenes. Meghan had delivered just one series, Archetypes, and despite its strong debut, it lacked consistency, scheduling, and creative agility. A former Spotify executive, speaking anonymously, said, "She wanted the title of executive producer without doing the work of one. She would approve an idea, then micromanage it into oblivion. Our team was constantly re-editing based on her moods." The podcast, meant to be a breakthrough.